Welcome, Coraline Ada.
Hi, everybody. It's actually Coraline Ada M. Key. They kind of got it wrong, but that's okay. I want to apologize in advance. This is not an uplifting talk. That's because I am angry. I'm angry about what happens to marginalized people as they get involved in open source. And as you listen to this talk, you're probably going to get angry too. And that's okay. We're going to be angry together. And from that anger, maybe we can make change. Oh, I have the thingy. Hashtag for this talk is OSS is broken. So who am I? I need to tell you a little bit about myself to provide some context for what's coming next. And please understand, I'm not trying to center myself or center my experiences, but I want to use my experiences as an example of the systemic problems that I'm going to be talking about. I fashioned myself as a code witch. That's because I code and I'm literally a witch. I've been building apps for the web since 1993, which is forever. I built my first website before there were graphical browsers. 23 years of experience, which sounds really weird when I say it out loud. I had love affairs with Perl and Java early on, but in 2007 I discovered Ruby, and I've been programming happily in that language ever since. I'm best known for creating a contributor covenant, which is the most popular open source code of conduct in the world, with over 14,000 adoptions, including JRuby, Elixir, Swift, and Rails. I'm on the board for an organization called RailsBridge, which traditionally has done outreach and workshops for women to get them involved in technology. And as a board member, my goal this year is to get more marginalized people beyond women also involved with RailsBridge programs. I'm also on the board for an organization called Ruby Together, which funds critical infrastructure programs in the Ruby community. I recently joined the Rails team, and I'm going to be working on making Rails more beginner-friendly. I created OS4W to help women and non-binary people get involved in open source and find mentors and pair partners. I was recognized for making Ruby a more diverse and welcoming community with a Ruby Hero Award this year at RailsConf. I work at GitHub on the community and safety team. My team is 4/5 women, 3/5 women of color, 2/5 transgender women, and we have a token white guy. I told you all this so that you could see the contrast between who I am and the work that I do and what a lot of people in the open source community think of me. First of all, something that I hear a lot is that I obviously don't code. Here's an example. What planet do these ham-beasts orbit on in which developers have a harassment problem? They're inventing a job because they're entirely useless at anything real. I'm constantly accused of not being a real programmer, whatever that means. This despite being active in open source since the 90s. This is a reaction on Hacker News to an article called 100 Awesome Women in the Open Source Community, a list that I was included on. And a person said, as soon as I saw Coraline M. Key, I closed the tab. Not a good list. Not that code is the most important thing that I do, but I made almost 1,600 contributions last year, and I have 110 open source repositories on GitHub. I'm the author of 25 Ruby libraries with over 300,000 downloads. But that's still not enough for me to qualify as a real programmer, apparently. Let's leave the programming to the programmers and the whining to the whiners, shall we? Also, I'm a liar because I'm trans. I don't know why any organization would hire someone pretending to be something they're not. If you're lying about your actual gender, then you very likely would have no issue lying about or covering up something else. Because of my mission to make open source more inclusive, I've been labeled a social justice warrior. I wear that title as a badge of honor, but it also means that I'm a frequent victim of harassment and personal attacks, nasty transphobic threads on Reddit and 4chan, and even hit pieces in right-wing media like Breitbart. I've been doxxed twice, which means that my home address and personal contact information has been published by my harassers. One of the reasons I'm targeted is because I'm a highly visible and highly opinionated woman in tech. Another reason is that I'm a transgender woman. But I think the main reason I'm a target is that I'm not satisfied with the status quo in open source. I think that we can be, and really we have to be, much, much better. And I don't mean as programmers, but rather as human beings. And if that makes me a social justice warrior, that's fine. My daughter, who is amazing, said social justice warrior sounds kind of badass. It sounds like a cross between you're a superhero and you have empathy for people. So what's the opposite of a social justice warrior? The best I could come up with is a status quo accountant. I firmly believe that my experiences of harassment and being targeted in open source are not unique, that they're intrinsic to the culture of open source, and that's what I want to talk about today. To understand what open source is all about, we need to understand the story of software development and how it has changed over time. So I'll give you a quick tour. The first programmers worked for governments, such as the people who were dedicated to top secret decryption programs during World War II. In the post-war era, computers found their way into private industry. Interestingly, the field of programming was dominated by women. And this trend continued through the 60s and 70s. Programming computers was considered women's work. By the mid-1980s, however, when personal computers started showing up in middle-class homes, games and computers started being marketed to males, and the number of women in computing leveled off and even began to decline. IBM started placing job ads targeting male programmers. The age of the geek had begun. Men and boys who had computers bought for them grew up to be geeks and hackers, some of whom had big ideas for how to be successful in the emerging world of technology. They worked out of their garages to create software and even hardware, and there was a revolution in the making. Most software was written by hobbyists, which was typically written in an interpreted language such as BASIC. And BASIC, because it was an interpreted language, could only be distributed as source code, not as an executable program. This called for a source code distribution system. Some software was available in magazines that would actually literally be source code listings that you would type into your personal computer in magazines. Some software was distributed online in the form of bulletin board systems. You used a telephone line that was not cellular to dial into a modem bank, and you would interact with other users and download software. And as a kid, I clearly recall software swap parties. We had multiple disk drives, so all of my dad's friends would come over with blank floppy disks, and we would load up the drives and make copies of software so everyone could get the latest game or the latest application. So in the early days of computing, software was shared, and generally most of it was in the public domain. But as corporations got involved, software became more and more proprietary. So there started being things like copy protection. So when I was a teenager, I wrote my own disk editing software as a way to circumvent copy protection. I would literally erase the bits of the program that were the copy protection. There's an entire subculture of people like me. We were called crackers. And when we cracked a particular piece of software, initially we'd put a splash page with your code name on it. And eventually we started doing full-blown animations and stuff. It was really cool. And it was called demos. And there was this whole demo scene that was really cool. So there's always a tension between the companies that produce software and the consumers that wanted to use it. It was an arms race. It was them versus us. But proprietary software was winning. And things changed with this printer in 1983. It's an HP laser printer. It was the first laser printer to enter the market. And a man named Richard Stallman in 1983 was working, was working in an AI lab at Xerox. And they had all of their operations networked. And if you wanted to use a lot of computing power or something along those lines, you would book time in the scheduling system. And when they added this laser printer, the laser printer became another resource in our network. So if you needed to print something out, you would book 30 minutes on the laser printer and do your print job, schedule your print job. The problem is, as a first product, it kind of sucked, and it would jam all the time. So if you had your 30 minutes scheduled and you go to pick up your papers and you find it jammed on page 4, it was kind of annoying. So Stallman decided to modify the printer driver such that it would report jams back to the network and back to the person who scheduled the time. The problem is that the software was proprietary, and HP would not give him access to the source code. He found that a colleague at MIT had the source code, but that person had signed a non-disclosure agreement with HP and wouldn't share it. So Stallman got really angry about this printer, but mainly about the fact that software was shifting from an open model to a proprietary model. And this incident with the printer led to another revolution, that of the free software movement. In the spirit of free software, Stallman eventually decided to write his own operating system. It was called GNU, which stands for GNU is not Unix, and a community formed around the development of GNU. In the mid to late 90s, when the world discovered the internet, free software became a popular choice for web servers. Apache became the most used web server software, a title that it still holds. And many systems were built around a common stack of open source software with the Linux kernel at the base, Apache providing web services, MySQL database for data storage, and PHP or Perl as a programming language for providing dynamic pages. This stack called LAMP is still very popular today. In 1997, a man named Eric Raymond, who we're going to talk about at length later, wrote an important paper called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which established a philosophical framework for what would become the open source movement. Raymond is credited with popularizing the term open source, but it was actually invented by a woman named Christine Peterson. No one remembers her. Netscape Navigator was the first commercial, or the first enterprise software, or big company software to be distributed with Source in 1997. This was a major milestone for the open source world. And with the advent of the internet, the problem of software distribution was pretty much solved. And programming suddenly went from being this arcane profession to something that anyone could do, because web browsers had this menu option called View Source. So you could actually go to your favorite website, view the source, and copy the HTML and learn how to program it. And after doing HTML statically for a while, you'd want to make something dynamic, so you'd learn a really easy-to-learn programming language like PHP or Perl, and thus a new generation of programmers was born. And now we live in an era of social coding. Sites like GitHub. Any GitHub customers in here? I'm so pleased. We're like this tiny startup, and we're really happy about our customers. So GitHub makes you code in public, and you can share and show off and collaborate on stuff. But the egalitarian ideal of equal access and equal involvement has fallen short of expectations of the early pioneers of the open source movement. And let's look at why. Open source was a reaction against the closed source software that was being produced by corporations. And early open source adopters shared a philosophy of openness and collaboration. They were idealists. So let's take a look at what fueled their idealism. Open source was founded on 4 principles: the free exchange of ideas, success through collaboration, shared ownership, and the one we're going to talk about a lot, meritocracy. On the surface, these 4 principles seem reasonable and revolutionary at the same time. But behind the idealism of early open source advocates were some very naive understandings of how the world works, naive understandings of systems of power. These advocates tended to be white males, university educated, and upper middle class, and thus had a lot of unexamined privilege. So let's take a look at how open source values fall short of the 4 principles. We'll start with the free exchange of ideas. Open source imagines a marketplace of ideas that are freely exchanged between peers. But the way software projects are organized, the way they're run, and even the way they're documented sends signals to people about who is welcome and who is not. The network effect ensures that the exchange of ideas in practice is limited to colleagues and peers who tend to look like each other, in other words, cisgender white males. This theoretical marketplace of ideas leads to collaboration, which produces software of greater value and utility than an individual could produce. But a side effect of collaboration in a non-diverse group is something called groupthink. This is Solomon Elliott Ash. He was a prominent American psychologist and a pioneer in social psychology. He's most well known for his conformity experiments. So he had this experiment that he conducted in 1955 using 123 male participants. And they were told that they would be part of a study for visual judgment. And each participant was put into a group of 5 to 7 other men. But only the person last in line, in the last chair, was actually an experimental subject, and everyone else was a Confederate with Solomon Ash. So the participants were shown a card like the one on the left, and they held a card in their hand like the one on the right, and they were asked to identify which line best matched the one that Solomon Ash was holding up. And Ash found that if the first person to answer the question gave the wrong answer, and a majority of people down the line gave the wrong answer, that the actual subject of the experiment was likely to give a wrong answer too. In fact, as the group size increased, that person was more likely to give an obviously wrong answer so as to conform with the expectations of the rest of the group. And sites like Hacker News use something very similar. They have these karma systems. Your karma goes up when people agree with you, and it goes down when people disagree. And the more karma you have, the more editorial control you have. And that kind of system really does some bad things for dissenting voices. The principle of shared ownership states that everyone involved in the creation of software has equal ownership, and so do the consumers of the software. So open source project management is supposed to be a departure from and a reaction against hierarchies. This harkens back to the notion of the cathedral and the bazaar. Eric Raymond was talking about bottom-up as opposed to top-down design, but the metaphor applies equally well to distributions of power. So corporations are organized into hierarchies, and decision-making power is concentrated at the top, as is responsibility for managing risk. Assets in a hierarchical organization are tightly controlled, and people are considered assets. Corporations are necessarily therefore conservative. Shared ownership means that assets are distributed, things are more likely to be not tightly controlled. And in a network, it's not people but information that's an asset. There's a high degree of trust and commitment, and risk-taking is encouraged because the cost of risk is very low. And this leads to revolutionary as opposed to evolutionary change. But in open source and practice, we see concentrations of power. And this concentration of power goes against the open source principles and leads to a kind of virtual classism. It's not shared ownership if one person or a group of 3 or 5 people are in charge. And benevolent dictatorships, like we see with Linux, are an anti-pattern, and they're antithetical to the principles of open source. Finally, the promise of meritocracy. Open source values don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in a world full of power imbalances. But they presume a post-racist, post-sexist, enlightened world free of oppression and free of ego. What happens when these values are placed in the real-world setting? They become tainted. They become instruments of oppression. And not least of these forms of oppression is the idea of meritocracy. On the surface, meritocracy seems like a fair and equitable system of governance. But built in is a presumption of equality that's not yet present in the world in which we live. It also presumes that power is distributed equally throughout all participants. And of course, we know that that doesn't happen because of political wrangling, egoism, cult of personality, and other forms of oppression. Meritocracy seeks to deliberately ignore the things that make human beings different from each other, like our identity, our social status, our genders, our race, our religion, anything that makes us individuals, anything that reflects our lived experience, anything that is not a pure product of intellectual creation. So we don't live in this egalitarian utopia. Even if cishet white males have trouble coming to terms with this, this is not a post-racist, post-sexist world. And the microcosm of the open source community reflects this. So I'd like to talk about diversity in open source. But actually I can't, because we only have statistics in women in open source. No one has bothered to measure people of color's participation or the participation of transgender men and women or non-binary people or queer developers as they participate in the open source world. But actually I have an announcement about this. As part of my work at GitHub, I have made the company commit to conducting a comprehensive demographic survey of open source developers. So for the first time ever, we will have statistics on the diversity of people who are contributing to open source. So I'm very happy about that. So women. Women make up approximately 20% of all developers, but only 2 to 6% of open source developers. It was recently, there was an organization called TopTal, which did analysis of 15,000 GitHub accounts and used automated mechanism to determine the gender of individual account holders. And they estimate that 6% of GitHub users are women. Most women who do open source make less than 10 contributions over their lifetime. They have a smaller number of personal projects than their male counterparts. If open source is truly meritocratic, that is a demonstration that cisgender, white, heterosexual males are biologically inclined to be the best programmers in the world. And I find that really hard to believe. Something else is definitely at play. At best, there are implicit biases in open source that prevent people from marginalized groups from participating and excelling. And at worst, there are people supporting systems that actually oppress diverse populations. So if meritocracy is the great equalizer, how is inequality even possible? To answer that question, let's take a look at what meritocracy actually means and where it came from. The term was coined by a British sociologist named Michael Young in a satirical essay called The Rise of the Meritocracy. In this essay, an unnamed narrator is describing the future of the United Kingdom. And the narrator observes that the greatest contributor to society is not the majority, but rather a creative minority, members of what he called a restless intellectual elite. Intelligence in this system becomes the predominant ideal. And while the narrator admits that there are casualties of progress that arise from a devotion to this ideal, he insists that the sacrifice is worthwhile. Placing a high value on intellectual value naturally gives rise to arrogance, but again, the narrator goes on to argue that the benefits to society make arrogance a tolerable fact. So meritocracy elevates intellect above all other aspects of what it means to be human and erases other parts of the human experience. And it's a terrible irony that Young's satirical essay became the foundation for how open source would be governed. The modern notion of meritocracy also derives from another source, a philosophical system called utilitarianism. It was thought up by a guy named Jeremy Bentham, and he defined utility as the aggregate pleasure that remains after deducting suffering from all involved in an action. This guy, John Stuart Mill, he looks very joyful, expanded the concept of utility to include not only the quantity but the quality of pleasure, and he focused on rules instead of individual moral actions. He wrote that moral action maximizes utility, and that's the core principle of utilitarianism. Bentham said, "It is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong." So literally, moral actions are defined as actions that create the most pleasure for the most number of people. So this, the core assumption is that we can perform a sort of moral calculus to determine the morality of a given action. And they actually named this the hedonistic calculus and believed that it could, in principle, determine the moral status of any act. This was an attempt to quantify pleasure and pain. Bentham wrote, "If pains must come, let them extend to the few." Inequalities or injustices that are inflicted upon a minority are thus deemed acceptable by this philosophy, so long as they don't interfere with the ability of the majority to experience pleasure. Cruel actions are condoned as long as they contribute to the greater good. Utilitarian ideals treat the comfort of producers as paramount. So by way of criticism, I introduced the utility monster. This was a concept that was created by the philosopher Robert Nozick in 1974. Utility monster demonstrates that utilitarianism is not egalitarian, even though it may appear that way at first glance. So let's imagine a community in which the average citizen consumes one resource and produces one unit of happiness. But then you have a utility monster in the community, and I use Cthulhu. Utility monsters get more pleasure and value from each unit of resources. So in this case, one resource, the utility monster produces 2 units of pleasure. Although, oh, my animation's gone. The utility monster looks like Cthulhu, but it's a substitution for a programmer. So if resources in the community are evenly distributed, the hedonistic calculus says that this community produces 7 units of happiness. But what happens if we increase the resources that the utility monster consumes? If we increase utility monster's resources and keep other people from access to those resources, the overall happiness or pleasure of the community has actually gone up to 9. And if we go to the most extreme case and give all the resources to the utility monster, the community is actually maximizing pleasure at that point with a 10. So at its best, utilitarianism objectifies the individual and strips them of their identity, and they become a mere variable in a moral calculus. And I would argue that the meritocratic underpinnings of open source are an extension of this utilitarian philosophy. In open source, it's often said that we don't care about your personality, only your code contributions matter. You consume resources in the form of energy and access and attention, and produce pleasure in the form of software value and value to a community. And your value is relegated to the code you create. The hedonistic calculus is replaced by your GitHub contribution graph. And the contributions that count are only code contributions. It doesn't matter if you paired with someone new, if you pushed for the adoption of a code of conduct, if you gave a talk, if you triaged issues to mark them as beginner-friendly, if you had a long conversation with the maintainers about how best to run the community. Only pull requests and issues open and commits matter. And in technology, we tend to devalue soft skills. And this is the invisible labor of open source. Invisible labor includes things like community building and outreach and peacemaking and diversity and inclusivity. And this is all stuff that is usually considered women's work. It's unpaid emotional labor that women and people of color and other people from marginalized groups tend to do all the time. So consider the average technical conference, and this is not an average technical conference, obviously. In recent years, women have been better represented at these conferences as a result of outreach work and the widespread adoption of codes of conduct and anonymized talk selection processes. The best talks that I've ever seen deal with the human side of technology. How to mentor, how to lead, how to be more empathetic, how to be a better person. The ones that I tend to forget in a month are the technical talks that are talking about shiny new technology X. But who's giving most of these soft talks? It's women and people of color. There are very few men who venture into the realm of the forbidden realm of the soft talk. That's because soft talks are considered not as valuable as technical talks. They're squishy, they're complicated, they're non-technical. How could they possibly be important as pipeline architectures and closure? Technical talks are recognized as relevant, while talks addressing the humanity of our profession are relegated to interesting thought exercises or a break between technical talks. Until there's a graph for making the world a better place, the hard work of making open source hospitable and welcoming will remain invisible work. It won't even factor into the hedonistic calculus. The founders of utilitarianism were opposed to slavery, and they believed in equality between the sexes. And I've already demonstrated that meritocracy derives from utilitarianism, so we might be led to think that in a meritocracy, people equally care about things like equality. But let's look at some real-life examples. This is a little hard to read. This is a pull request by a guy named Alex Gaynor that was opened in November of 23 on a project called Joyant. He removed gendered language from the documentation, replacing he and him with they and their. Some users thought it was unnecessary, but generally the people who commented on the thread were supportive of the change. But the lead coder on the project rejected the change. And when another maintainer accepted and merged the pull request, Ben Nordhaus, the project owner, actually reverted the change and scolded the person who accepted the PR. 228 comments on the issue, and the issue was finally closed. This is a pull request from the Apple Swift project from December 2015. It replaces the highly charged terms master and slave with leader and follower. And this is a comment on that pull request. Master-slave are perfectly acceptable words in the English language. If you're offended by these terms in some code base, then you most likely have too much time on your hands. Open source leaders are modeling behavior which makes this kind of thinking acceptable. Linus Torvalds said all the diversity stuff is just details, not really important. Here's another popular open source leader, Eric Raymond, who's credited, as I said, with popularizing the term open source. He writes, in the US, blacks are 12% of the population but commit 50% of violent crimes. Can anyone honestly think this is unconnected to the fact that they average 15 points of IQ lower than the general population? An obviously racist statement, and how do people in the open source community react to it? I'll agree it's rather disturbing. However, does it detract from his technical work? So again, we're ignoring the people behind the technology and just focusing on their intellectual output. In November of 2015, Eric Raymond decided to write this article, Why Hackers Must Eject the Social Justice Warriors. And in it, he specifically targets me and my work on codes of conduct. It's clear that the author of the conduct, self-described transgender feminist Coraline wants to replace the so-called cult of meritocracy with something else. And equally clear that what they want to replace it with is racial and sexual identity politics. This is about whether we will allow diversity issues to be used as wedges to fracture our community, degrade the quality of our work, and draw us away from our duty. Why does he think that diversity degrades quality? And what exactly is our duty in this circumstance? RubyConf 2013, they had a problem with diversity. They had an almost all-male lineup. And how did the leaders of the Ruby community respond to this crisis? This is a tweet by Mats, who is the inventor of the Ruby programming language and the person who controls the future of the language. He says, RubyConf is not a tool to solve our social problems. If the program has no explicit discrimination, let it be. We have Rails girls instead. He says, giving bias to a minority does not solve the problem. It creates reverse discrimination, which of course does not actually exist. So it's a little wonder that when I opened a pull request on the Ruby codebase asking to adopt a code of conduct, he refused it and removed himself from any responsibility for anything beyond the code of Ruby, ignoring the community. So how do we fight back? What can we do to change things? We can send overt signals that our open source projects are open and welcoming by adopting codes of conduct. We can find diverse viewpoints online, read blogs that talk about intersectionality, read blogs and posts about fighting sexism and racism and classism and homophobia and transphobia. Recognize that there are intersections of systems of oppression. And when we find powerful voices talking about these problems, we can amplify them. We can find organizations that work to address systemic problems and support them in any way we can. Find the work that we're passionate about and throw ourselves into it. Volunteer to mentor, volunteer at events, organize a meetup, speak at a conference. Find people who are like you and join together for support and strength. And if you make a tech industry salary, you should consider devoting a portion of that salary to regular donations to organizations that are trying to make a difference. You should meet up with other people who are doing open source and build a support network. Pair up, find like-minded people. And set a good example. Open source your own code and welcome and invite collaboration. Recognize that you may struggle, and recognize that the hardest part of open source is not the code. It comes down to a question of values and how we choose to live those values. Software development is historically driven by a demographic that values intelligence over all else. And it's little wonder that among such a demographic, the worship of rationality and objectivity would be paramount. But the religious devotion to the idea of meritocracy perpetuates a system of classism. It props up an elite minority that spends its time catering to an idealized body of homogeneous consumers. This upper class is given a mandate to ensure progress at all costs. They dictate what is valuable and what is worthless. They maintain their status through the distribution of investments, of wages, and opportunities. This means that they're essentially gatekeepers over the means of intellectual production. A privileged few are empowered to limit access to advancement and prosperity. And the importance of access cannot be overstated. As more diverse individuals, usually from non-traditional backgrounds, seek entry into our field, there's a conflict between an emphasis on our humanity and the purely rational values of utility. At the center of this conflict is a tension between the idealism on which open source was founded and the reality of the world in which it is practiced. And at stake is the very future of our industry. Will we adhere to utilitarian ideals that place rationality above our humanity? Will we embrace a messy, beautiful, and ambiguous world in which we celebrate ourselves as human beings first and producers of intellectual value second? In the end, will our value as individuals be measured by the quality of our code or the quality of the human connections that we make? Thank you.